The ink is still wet on the vellum. A monk's hand trembles, not from cold, though the North Sea wind cuts through the scriptorium walls like a blade through wet cloth. His fingers tremble because of the screaming. Somewhere beyond the stone walls of the priory church, a brother is dying. The sound is not the peaceful exhalation of a man surrendering to God. It is the shriek of a pig being gutted alive. And the smell that follows? Iron thick, warm, unmistakable, is blood mixing with the salt air of the Northumbrian coast. The date is June 8th, 793 AD. And on the tiny tidal island of Lindisfarne, the world as Christendom knows it is ending. But you have never been told the truth about this day. Not really. Every Viking movie, every History Channel dramatization, every oil painting of horned warriors storming a beach, all of it has sold you a clean cinematic lie. The helmets had no horns. The monks were not gentle scholars quietly illuminating manuscripts by candlelight. And the raid itself was not some epic, large-scale military invasion. It was closer to a home robbery that ended in a massacre. A small group of Norsemen, maybe 40, maybe 60, certainly not hundreds, rowing longships across open water for days, arriving at a place that had no walls, no garrison, no weapons. They came because Lindisfarne was the easiest target in all of Britain. And the monks inside, they had been warned. Not by scouts, not by signal fires, by omens that had been terrifying them for months. To understand what happened that day, you first need to forget every comfortable image you have of a medieval monastery. Lindisfarne, in the late 8th century, was not a grand stone cathedral. Most of its buildings were timber-framed, with wattle and daub walls packed with mud and animal dung to keep out the wind. The church itself, the priory, was the only structure of real stone, and even that was modest by continental standards. Think of a building roughly the size of a modern suburban house, with thick walls, narrow window slits, and a floor of packed earth partially covered by rough flagstones. The roof leaked. It always leaked. Monks stuffed wool rags into cracks between the stones and prayed the Atlantic storms would not rip the timber beams apart. The island itself sat just off the northeast coast of England, connected to the mainland by a causeway that disappeared twice daily beneath the tides. At low tide, you could walk across. At high tide, Lindisfarne became an island in every sense, isolated, exposed, surrounded by gray water that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The monks saw this as divine protection. God had given them a fortress of water. They were wrong. What the tides actually gave them was a trap. When the Norsemen arrived, there was nowhere to run. Daily life on Lindisfarne was not the romanticized existence of prayerful contemplation that modern imagination likes to construct. A monk's day began at roughly 2 in the morning, jolted awake for the first service of prayer called vigils. The dormitory was a long timber hall with straw pallets on the floor, each man sleeping in his robes because the cold made undressing dangerous. There was no heating. In January, the temperature inside the dormitory hovered just above freezing. The monks slept with their shoes on. After vigils, there was no return to sleep. The brothers shuffled into the church for lauds at dawn, then prime at 6 in the morning, then terce at 9. Between these prayer services, the real labor began. Lindisfarne was self-sustaining, which meant every monk was also a farmer, a fisherman, a builder, a baker. The island's soil was thin and poor, battered by salt spray. Growing barley required constant work. Breaking the rocky ground with iron-tipped wooden plows pulled not by oxen, which the monastery could not afford, but by the monks themselves. 2 or 3 men would haul the plow while one guided it. Their hands were not the soft, pale hands of scholars. They were cracked, calloused, often bleeding from rope burns and splinters. The clothing they wore was no better than the shelter they slept in. Each monk owned a single woolen habit, one garment, worn day and night, summer and winter, until it literally fell apart and was replaced. Beneath the habit, a rough linen undertunic that chafed the skin raw in wet weather. No socks. Leather sandals in summer, and in winter, crude hide boots stuffed with straw for insulation that soaked through within minutes of stepping outside. The wool was undyed, unwashed except by rain, and after months of continuous wear, it carried a smell that modern people would find unbearable. A dense, sour odor of sweat, lanolin, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of mildew. Food was monotonous and scarce. The standard meal was a porridge of barley or oats, sometimes supplemented with dried fish, turnips, or wild seabird eggs collected from the cliffs at extraordinary risk. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days and for the sick. Bread, when they had it, was flat, dense, and often gritty with sand from the millstone. The monks ground their own grain by hand, using a rotary quern, a process so tedious that it could take 2 hours to produce enough flour for a single day's loaves. Fresh water came from a single well near the center of the compound. In dry summers, the well ran low, and the brothers rationed drinking water while still requiring themselves to perform hours of back-breaking agricultural work. Hygiene was minimal. The monks bathed perhaps once a month, if that. Lice were universal. Skin infections, boils, and fungal diseases were constant companions. The latrine was a timber shed built over a pit at the edge of the compound, exposed to the wind on 3 sides. In winter, monks relieved themselves as quickly as possible and returned to whatever shelter they could find. Intestinal parasites were endemic. Archaeological evidence from comparable monastic sites has found roundworm and whipworm eggs in latrine deposits, suggesting that virtually every inhabitant carried some form of parasitic infection. Medical care was prayer. A sick monk was anointed with oil, placed before the altar, and commended to God. If he recovered, it was a miracle. If he died, it was God's will. There were no physicians on Lindisfarne, no herbal remedies beyond what the brothers could gather from the island's sparse vegetation: dock leaves for skin irritation, chamomile for stomach cramps, and honey applied to wounds when the monastery's single beehive produced enough surplus. The average life expectancy for a man in 8th century Northumbria was roughly 35 years. Monks sometimes lived longer. The regularity of meals, however meager, and the absence of battlefield violence gave them a slight advantage. But disease, particularly tuberculosis and dysentery, cut through monastic communities with devastating regularity. In the decades before the raid, Lindisfarne had already buried dozens of its own brothers in the small cemetery east of the church. And yet, despite all of this, the cold, the hunger, the parasites, the relentless labor, Lindisfarne was considered one of the jewels of Christendom. Its fame rested not on wealth or military power, but on one thing: its manuscripts. The scriptorium, a cramped room attached to the church, was where monks produced some of the most extraordinary illuminated texts in the history of Western civilization. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created roughly a century before the raid, were a masterwork of art and devotion, each page decorated with interlocking spirals, animal motifs, and pigments derived from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, a journey of over 4,000 miles. The ink was made from oak galls and iron sulfate. The vellum came from calfskin. Roughly 150 calves slaughtered to produce enough pages for a single gospel book. This was what the monks were protecting. Not gold, not silver chalices, not land deeds or political alliances. They were protecting the Word of God, rendered in pigment and skin. And it is this fact that makes the events of June 8, 793, not just a historical footnote, but a theological catastrophe. The omens had begun months before the ships appeared. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in the year 793, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria. Immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons seen flying through the air. Modern historians interpret these as unusual weather phenomena. Perhaps a volcanic eruption in Iceland had colored the skies with ash and created electrical storms. But to the monks of Lindisfarne, steeped in a worldview where every natural event was a message from God, these signs could mean only one thing: divine punishment was coming. Some of the older brothers whispered that it was retribution for the sins of the Northumbrian kings, their wars, their adulteries, their failure to tithe properly to the church. Others simply prayed harder. Then came the famine. The harvest of 792 had been poor across northern England. By early 793, food stores on Lindisfarne were desperately low. The brothers were eating seaweed boiled into a thin broth and rationing their barley to a handful per man per day. Weakened by hunger, several monks had already fallen ill. The community that greeted the summer of 793 was gaunt, exhausted, and spiritually shaken by months of apocalyptic signs in the sky. If you have never imagined that life inside a holy monastery could be this brutal, this raw, this far removed from the peaceful cloisters of your imagination, hit the like button now. Because the history they never taught you in school is the history that actually matters. And it is about to get much worse. The ships appeared on the morning of June 8th. The first monk to see them was likely the brother assigned to tend the island's small flock of sheep on the eastern pastures. From that vantage point, looking out across the gray expanse of the North Sea, he would have seen shapes emerging from the mist, low, sleek, moving fast under both sail and oar. Viking longships were designed for exactly this kind of approach. Shallow draft, high speed, near invisible until they were almost upon you. These were not the bulky merchant Norse that occasionally appeared off the coast. These were warships, long, narrow, with carved prows and rows of painted shields lashed to the gunwales. Each ship carried perhaps 30 men, sitting shoulder to shoulder on sea chests that doubled as rowing benches, their weapons stored beneath their feet. The crossing itself had been brutal. From western Norway or Denmark to the Northumbrian coast was a voyage of several days across open water. No landmarks, no compass, nothing but the position of the sun and the flight patterns of seabirds to guide navigation. The men in those ships had eaten dried fish and flatbread, slept in shifts on the open deck with no shelter from rain or spray, and relieved themselves over the side of the hull while their companions rowed. They arrived hungry, cramped, and primed for violence. The monk would not have recognized what he was seeing. Lindisfarne had no experience with Scandinavian raiders. The Norsemen had been trading along the North Sea coast for decades, but armed raids on Christian sites were virtually unknown before this moment. The brother probably thought they were merchant vessels, or perhaps emissaries from a foreign kingdom. By the time the keels scraped onto the sand and the armed men leaped into the shallows, axes in hand, shields on their backs, screaming in a language no one on the island understood, it was already too late. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter conducted against unarmed men. The Norsemen moved through the compound with terrifying efficiency. They knew what they were looking for: portable wealth, church silver, chalices, crosses, reliquaries, candlesticks. These objects were the concentrated wealth of generations of Christian donations, offered by kings and nobles in exchange for prayers. To the monks, they were sacred vessels consecrated to God. To the raiders, they were metal. Nothing more. The monks who tried to protect the altar were cut down where they stood. The Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin of York, writing in the immediate aftermath, described brothers being killed at the very altars where they had celebrated Mass that morning. Some were drowned in the sea, dragged to the water's edge and held under until they stopped struggling. Others were stripped naked and driven out into the cold, left to die of exposure on the rocks. Several were taken as slaves, bound with rope and loaded into the longships alongside the plundered silver. Slavery was a core component of the Viking economy. A healthy monk, literate, obedient, accustomed to hard labor, was a valuable commodity in the slave markets of Scandinavia and the Islamic world. The raid itself probably lasted no more than a few hours. The Norsemen had no interest in occupation. They came, they took, they killed, and they left with the tide. When the waters rose and the longships pulled away from the beach, what remained on Lindisfarne was a scene of absolute devastation. The church had been ransacked. Bodies lay in the nave, in the doorways, on the path leading down to the shore. The scriptorium, whether it was damaged or spared, is unknown, but the psychological violation was total. The holiest site in Northumbria, the spiritual cradle of English Christianity, had been profaned by pagans. The shockwave that followed was not military, it was existential. Alcuin, who was serving at the court of Charlemagne when news reached him, wrote a letter that still survives, one of the most anguished documents of the early medieval period. He asked a question that shook the foundations of Christian theology. How could God allow his own house to be destroyed? How could the saints who protected Lindisfarne, St. Cuthbert, whose relics lay in the church, permit pagan swords to spill Christian blood on consecrated ground? Alcuin had no answer. He could only conclude that England's sins had grown so monstrous that God had withdrawn his protection. The raid was not a random act of violence. It was divine judgment. This interpretation shaped everything that followed. For the monks who survived Lindisfarne, and for the entire Christian world that heard the news, the Viking raid was not a political or military event. It was a sign that the end times were approaching. The dragons in the sky, the famine, the slaughter. It all fit the prophetic framework of Revelation. The Norsemen were not just raiders. They were instruments of God's wrath, sent to punish a sinful world. And here is the part that history books rarely mention. The monks did not abandon Lindisfarne. Not immediately. Not for decades. Despite the horror of June 793, despite the knowledge that the raiders could return at any moment, the surviving brothers rebuilt. They patched the walls. They reconsecrated the altars. They buried their dead in graves hastily dug into the sandy soil east of the church, marking each one with a simple stone cross. They wrote letters to the bishops of Canterbury and York, begging for help that would never come. They continued to pray at 2 a.m, to grind barley with bleeding hands, to copy scripture onto vellum by the dim light of tallow candles. The psychological scars were invisible but permanent. Every morning, the brother assigned to watch the sheep on the eastern pasture would scan the horizon with a fear that had no name in his vocabulary. Every unfamiliar sail on the North Sea brought a surge of nausea. The sound of oars, even the oars of friendly fishing boats from the mainland, made grown men flinch. We would call it post-traumatic stress. They called it a trial from God. And they bore it the only way they knew how. With prayer, with fasting, with the grinding repetition of sacred routine. The community endured for nearly another century. Through repeated Viking raids in 875, through famine, through plague, before finally evacuating the island, carrying with them the bones of St. Cuthbert and the Lindisfarne Gospels. The journey inland was itself an ordeal. Monks who had never traveled more than a mile from the island's shore now walked for weeks through hostile territory, carrying the heavy wooden reliquary of their patron saint on their shoulders, sleeping in fields, begging food from terrified villagers who saw the monks' arrival as yet another omen of doom. That book survived. Across 1,200 years of war, fire, dissolution, and neglect, the Lindisfarne Gospels survived. They sit today in the British Library in London, behind climate-controlled glass, illuminated by soft artificial light. Visitors shuffle past and glance at the intricate knotwork patterns, maybe snap a photograph, maybe read the placard. Most of them have no idea that the pages they are looking at were made from the skins of animals raised on an island where men ate seaweed to survive. That the pigments were ground by hands swollen with cold. That the prayers written in those margins were composed by men who would one day be dragged from their beds and butchered by strangers from across the sea. If this story has changed the way you see history, if you now understand that the past was not a series of dates and battles, but a grinding, relentless experience of survival, then subscribe to this channel, because this is what we do here. We strip away the myths and take you inside the lived reality of human history. Every week. Now think about your own morning. You woke up in a heated room. You had clean water from a tap. You ate food that was transported to you from across the world, prepared in minutes, consumed without gratitude. You checked your phone. You scrolled through images of violence and suffering that you did not feel, that cost you nothing, that vanished from your mind within seconds. A monk on Lindisfarne woke up in a freezing dormitory at 2 in the morning, walked barefoot across stone floors to pray for a world he would never see beyond the horizon. He ground grain until his shoulders burned. He copied sacred text letter by letter, knowing he might never finish the page. And when the screaming started, when the axes came through the doors, he did not run. He stood at the altar. He prayed. We have everything they did not have: warmth, safety, abundance beyond their most extravagant imagination. And yet something in us knows, instinctively, uncomfortably, that those men possessed something we have lost: a weight to their days, a meaning in their suffering, a conviction that every hour mattered because every hour was offered to something greater than themselves. The ink on the vellum dried 12 centuries ago. The hand that held the quill is dust. But the words remain. And if you listen closely enough, across the silence of all those centuries, you can almost hear him writing. One final entry, one final prayer. Before the dragons came,